Hey everyone, Sindhu here. Today I'm going to explore the concept of white adjacency. And I'm focusing on this concept because it's so important for Black, Indigenous people of color to be aware of the often subconscious tendency and desire to center whiteness in our personal and professional lives. So, when we, as Black, Indigenous people of color, engage in white adjacent behaviors and thinking, we work to strengthen the system of whiteness that is pervasive and omnipresent rather than disrupt it. And all that does is help our systems and our institutions continue to operate on white dominant norms, which creates a big roadblock to racial inclusion. As most of you know, in the United States, Black, Indigenous people of color collectively will soon be the majority population. Now, I want to pause and just clarify that white folks aren't going anywhere. They will still be the majority race. But when we add up all the other communities of color together in the United States, BIPOC will be the majority. Now, that fact is a threat to many people. But in reality, this increasing racial diversity really doesn't mean a whole lot if we as BIPOC continue to engage in white adjacent behaviors that foster, center, and allow for whiteness to thrive. So let's take a look at what white adjacency is so that we can all be informed, aware, and collectively reject this practice. White adjacency occurs when a person aligns themselves with the white dominant culture while distancing themselves from the traditions, the norms, the cultural and communication practices of their ethnic and their racial heritage. So BIPOC who practice white adjacency have access to, utilize, and sometimes benefit from white privilege. So this might be news to some of you, but you don't have to be white to embody and benefit from whiteness. And that's because whiteness is a social construction. The thing about white adjacency is that it's often done subconsciously, but it works to strengthen the system of white supremacy, which works to oppress people of color. So white adjacency can show up in many different ways. I'm just going to give you a few examples so that we can have a baseline understanding of this concept. One way we can be white adjacent is to anglicize our names to fit in. For example, I changed my name from Sindhu to Cindy for many years to avoid the racist name calling and bullying of my youth. Many immigrants and children of immigrants also anglicize their names to blend in and assimilate to the white dominant norms of our country. And that includes white immigrants as well, not just immigrants of color. The reality is that our given names are beautiful and they have meaning, and it's important to remember that just because we may have a unique or different name, it doesn't mean that it's a deficient one. Different does not mean deficient. Another example is adhering to Eurocentric beauty standards. So doing things like wearing colored contacts to brighten our brown or black eyes, or straightening or relaxing our hair, or lightening our skin to appear more fair are all examples of intentionally working to adhere to the dominant Eurocentric beauty standards that we might feel make us more accepted and attractive. Another thing we can do is code switch. Code switching to standard American English or working to reduce our accent rather than being proud of it. Linguistic supremacy exists in our institutions in the US, but the reality is, in the US, we do not have an official language. So speaking a different vernacular of English doesn't equate to a lack of intelligence. And having an accent doesn't mean that you're not smart. In fact, it suggests otherwise. Research shows that the more languages we speak, the more intelligent we are. So be proud of your home language and don't hide your accent because they add to the richness and the beauty of the diversity of our country. At one point in our history, assimilating to white American norms while working to erase our cultural norms that were not aligned with the white dominant culture was a necessary survival tactic in the racial caste system that we all are a part of. Many early immigrants, including my own parents, engaged in white adjacency to better assimilate and thrive in the very white America that they arrived to. A few examples of this could be not teaching our children our native tongue, not raising our children with our native foods, or not participating in the traditions, the rituals, and the customs of our homeland. Now, these things were done to help us blend into the larger American landscape, not because we were necessarily ashamed or embarrassed of where we came from or who we are. So, white adjacency also occurs in our workplaces. Many employees of color engage in white adjacent behaviors to gain upward mobility and success in their careers. This could look like centering the comfort of white leaders or being complicit in organizational policies that work to disadvantage employees of color, or downplaying or denying the existence of racism or xenophobia that exist in our organizations. All this does is perpetuate further harm to employees of color, and it can also badly damage the culture of your organization. And the reality is, so many of us have subconsciously learned that if we conform to the standards of whiteness, we will be more palatable and also more accepted. And in many cases, those who have engaged in white adjacency have received more opportunities to excel in their careers and in our society, and have been given more respect and praise. We can look to political leaders to better understand how white adjacency manifests. Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley are two South Asian Republican presidential candidates who are actively engaging in white adjacency. Vivek has publicly denied the existence of racism and continues to push the myth of meritocracy to the larger American public. And Nikki has whitewashed our nation's racist history to appeal to right-wing voters. We can also look at the infamous example of Clarence Thomas, who's a Black Supreme Court judge who since the early 80s has perpetuated anti-Blackness and undermined the system of racism that has worked to disenfranchise Black Americans. So instead of uplifting and advocating for racially minoritized communities, these BIPOC politicians and leaders align themselves with whiteness, which is what allows them to get into these positions of power in the first place. So if you're learning about this concept for the first time and are realizing that you might have engaged in white adjacent behaviors, please don't feel ashamed or bad. I myself centered whiteness for half of my life, and I was blindly doing it until I woke up through my own education. If you're actually able to identify and name how you have contributed to white adjacency, that's the first step to disrupting those behaviors and reclaiming your authenticity. As James Baldwin famously said, we can't fix what we can't face. So I encourage all of you watching this to reflect on the ways that you have engaged in white adjacency. Because if we aren't actively facing and resisting the tendency to conform to white dominant norms, the system of whiteness will continue to thrive in our communities, in our workplaces, and in our society, regardless of the increasing racial diversity that will soon make the United States a BIPOC majority country. So when we stand in solidarity with each other, we don't allow the systems of white supremacy to win. So I encourage all of you to take steps to resist and discourage white adjacency in the communities and the families that you live in. Thanks for listening.